Nick Goldschmidt. I'm the winemaker for Goldschmidt Vineyards, Forefathers, and a number of other brands under the Goldschmidt portfolio. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what my understanding is for site-specific winemaking. In an earlier video, you saw me talk about Alexander Valley versus Napa Valley, and also you saw me talk about East Row orientation versus West Row orientation and how important it is for that. But if we were to look back at a block of grapes, and if we can imagine the rows of that block growing in this direction, it's very interesting that when you talk about great wine regions of the New World, it's almost always in an earthquake zone, whether it's Chile or New Zealand or even California. And so the soils vary very greatly in a short distance. So you can imagine if there was a soil swale that came like this through that vineyard, and each one of these pieces of the row ripen in a different condition. If you think back to how wines taste, and I talked earlier about what complexity means, I'm going to go one step further and combine that. Complexity also can be ranged into three different sorts of flavor profiles on the tongue. And the three flavor profiles to me are the elegant wines, which are the soft berry fruit wines up on front of the tongue, the powerful wines, which provide the flesh and the weight and the richness in the middle of the tongue, and then the dense wines, which provide the structure of the wine and the tannin. And when you have those three things together, you have complexity. So that's my definition of what a complex wine is. Now, coming back to the vineyard, we'll go out and we make picking decisions based on how things taste in terms of flavor and tannin. And what we find is we go out there and let's say, imagine if you will, this piece here, say that I consider this piece to be ripe at 135 days, and this piece to be ripe at 145 days, and this piece to be ripe at 155 days, just for point of the exercise. So we would go out here and we'd pick this section first because maybe the soil's a little thinner, the canopy was a little thinner, I had a little bit more exposure, versus this wine here or these grapes here, which had a little bit more vigor, and so we were able to hang those things out a little bit longer. When we bring these things into the winery and make wine out of them, it's sort of a reverse psychology. What we typically find is the wines that we make from here have a lot of tannin because they ripen faster relative to the fruit. Whereas these guys here have less tannin and tend to be more fruit driven. So typically these wines produce the dense wines, and these wines produce the elegant wines, and these ones produce the powerful wines. So when we bring that wine into the winery, we're going to make these wines differently. And if you can imagine a tank, and in the tank is you've got the seeds at the bottom of the tank, you've got the cap, and then you have the wine that sits in the tank. And where this cap sits in contact with the wine is the most important piece of the ferment, because that's where all the heat is. That's where the heat is generated from the yeast, and that's where we get all the extraction, all the alcohol gets pulled out. And so that's why we talk about things about pump overs or punch downs, or this new thing called pulse air, where we're mixing the cap up with the wine. So in a dense wine, what I do is I ferment a little cooler. I'll ferment it, say 22 to 24 Celsius. I give very short pump overs or punch downs. I don't give much oxygen, because if I give the yeast oxygen, it's going to make them ferment harder and stronger. And after fermentation is finished, I'll actually warm the tank up. I'll warm the tank up to about 28 degrees Celsius, and I'll still pump over a little bit. And the reason for doing that is I'm trying to soften the wine. I'm trying to make the tannins softer, richer, and rounder. Now, in an elegant wine, I'm going to do completely the opposite, because I know in an elegant wine I've got more fruit and less tannin, so I can extract the bejesus out of that. I can ferment a little warmer. I'll ferment at, say, 30 degrees Celsius. I will increase the amount of pump overs. I'll give them a lot of oxygen, and after fermentation is finished, I actually allow that wine to cool down, and I'll let it go down to about 18 degrees Celsius for the maceration period. And what 18 degrees is doing is actually slowing down the extraction. And if you can imagine a young wine is purple, and as that wine gets older, it goes from purple to red to brown to orange. The things that make a wine purple is this core compound called an anthocyanin. An anthocyanin is purple, and as you provide more heat, light, or air, or time, that anthocyanin basically runs around and joins onto another anthocyanin, and that becomes a tannin, and this thing is red. If you provide more heat, light, air, or time, that compound gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's what we call polymerization, and that's what falls out. And you know, as a wine ages, you often see on the shoulder of a bottle a little bit of, people call tartrates or other material that's stuck to the side of the bottle. Basically what that is tannins falling out through time. That is not going to happen in my wine. what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that wine stable in terms of tannins during the fermentation process. And so you won't see that with my wines as they age. But basically, this is what site-specific winemaking is all about. Going out into the vineyard, deciding which piece of the vineyard is going to ripen first, which one's going to be the most fruity, which one's going to be the most tannin, and then correctly dialing in the right winemaking to match that specific site in the vineyard. And that's what I do for all my Cabernets and Merlots and Pinot Noirs throughout the Goldschmidt portfolio.